Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you're as excited as I am to this presentation that I'm calling Gender. I hardly know them. Here's an agenda for our time together. Soon, you'll learn a little bit more about me. Then we'll buckle in to go explore beyond the binary. We'll learn a little bit more about gender history. We'll chat about how to make inclusive choices. And of course, we'll talk about figuring out our values. And lastly, and most importantly, we'll end with a Q&A. So throughout this whole presentation, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the app, and we'll get to them at the end. But now, you might be asking yourselves, who is this gorgeous creature on stage talking to you about gender? Well, I thought you'd never ask. My name is Carlos García León, but if you can't do the trill of the R, Carlos is just fine. I'm a queer, non-binary, Latina, Mexican statesian. I'm an individual with light brown skin, black wavy hair, with a short fade on the sides and a slash on the left side going through my eyebrow, transparent glasses, brown eyes. Today, I'm wearing a two-piece set, which is blue and with white stripes, chunky tan boots, and I love a chunky heel because I can do a lot with them. My pronouns are he, they. Recently, though, I heard someone say the phrase, I use all respectful pronouns, and I very much vibe with that, too. And now, you might have noticed that I didn't say my preferred pronouns, which leads me to my first point of the day. Saying preferred makes it seem like using someone's pronouns is optional, when in reality, using a person's pronouns is the most basic need they have to feel safe and to exist in public spaces. As for my work persona, I'm the individual giving manager for Chicago Shakespeare Theater, where I've been for over a year. This presentation, or an earlier version of this presentation, actually began there when I first joined, because a lot of my colleagues would ask me, what does he, they mean? Or how do I refer to you? And it was really nice that they wanted to ask me these questions, and in very much that sense, get to respect me. But I was ultimately worried about how they could advocate for me when I wasn't in the room, and if it had enough resources to speak on behalf of me, or maybe any other non-binary coworker we had. So a couple of non-binary folks at work, thankfully I have more than just one, got together to make the first draft of this. I want to give a shout out to them for making this possible for you all. Their names are Mercedes Hoover, they, she, our education programs associate, and Phoebe Silva, she, they, our assistant house manager. I absolutely love them, and without this input, I wouldn't be here without them. I've been an arts fundraiser for a little over 4 years, and in that realm, in alphabetical, but also in order of importance, I'm an anti-capitalist, community-centric, theoretical fundraiser. Oh, absolutely, yeah. I come from orchestra world. I moved into slam poetry. If any of the words I say today feel you in the spirits, in the bones, in the mind, feel free to clap. I enjoy death clapping as well. You can woo if you want. But if you do boo, you do have to leave. You're all welcome to ask more about any of these titles at the end, because I do love talking about how I wish philanthropy would work to end itself. But today, we aren't diving. Today, we aren't diving into philanthropy. Today, we are just dipping our toes into the vast mysteries of gender. So let's start from the beginning, beyond binary. And we'll begin with a blank canvas for this. Many of us, myself included, have been taught in our childhood and our early education and experiences that there are only two genders, and that it is attached to the sex we're born with. And we've also been fed the lie that there are two sexes in this world, which is complete erasure of intersex people. Let me demonstrate this through some imagery. Our knowledge of gender and sex looks like these 2 points, where man is here, woman is there. However, sex and gender are not the same thing. Sex, it refers to a set of biological and physiological characteristics between people, which is often assigned to us at birth by looking at our genitals. Here's where I can add intersex people, who may not have an anatomy that fits in this binary thinking. Meanwhile, gender is a social construct that brings in thoughts, ideas, behaviors, characteristics, expressions, and social structures of being. A perfect example of gendering something is the idea of colors. The blue are for boys and pink are for girls, something we see a lot at gender reveal parties or and the like. And because gender is a social construct, people have begun thinking about it as a spectrum. This is a great way of thinking about gender. But gender is, I'm not sorry to say, a little bit more complicated than that. So we also have to consider gender expression, which is another social construct. And here we'll have it as a y-axis, with one end being masculine and one other being feminine. So now we have this x-axis as gender, a concept of gender, and the y-axis as gender expression. And I'm giving you all a second to think about it, so grab water, write it down. Okay, so now that we've processed this just a bit, and maybe, as I told you, written out because there will be a quiz at the end, you might be thinking, is this already a lot? Is there more to this? Yes, there is. Let me add another layer for you all. The z-axis, or how much it matters to the individual, the saturation. On one end is it matters, very, very important. And the other end is, whatever, I could care less. And all of this was introduced to me as the infinite gender cube, trademark pending. Thank you to @NowIt'sLauren for creating this knowledge, and to TikTok for the algorithm on my For You page. So let me take another pause for you all to conceptualize this 3D concept, because I know it took me a minute. To give you a couple of examples, we have the tomboy girl, someone who expresses themselves in masculinity traits, but is still considered themselves as a girl. We also have the agender boy, the elusive agender boy, someone who may not care to align with any gender, but still has a connection to manhood. And then there's someone like me, someone who sometimes usually presents male because it's very comfortable and safe in this country, but also very fluid at times, which is why I added tiny arrows. Now that you've gotten a chance to visualize this gender cube, I can ask you, what are your coordinates? I hope you take some time to think about it, and also think about the ability to move around this cube, if you'd like. Now, I won't go into the reasons why gender has been enforced as a binary, but the main reasons are rooted in prejudice, power, and oppression, typical stuff. This is why trans and non-binary folks are such magical creatures, and thus nuances to power, because we are dismantling the notions that were created to keep us in boxes. And here I say us, as in all of us, because the gender binary is harmful to all of us. Since we're getting into some heavy material soon, let me lighten things up a bit. Here is a picture of me as a baby. Yes, very cute. I read this nowadays as my contemplation about identity, thinking about masculinity with the soccer ball. I grew up in Mexico, born and raised in Mexico, so like soccer being the national sport, the expectations of my parents playing this game, and what it means to be a boy in this country. And my conclusion, as you'll see in this next picture, is I don't like it. This is not for me. Mom, please take me away. Gosh, I was really pulling off looks even back then. Worked. When I was thinking myself as a boy, there was countless of times that my elders would say not to cry, because crying is not a manly thing to do. No llores. Or police the way I walked, the way I talked, the way I moved my hands. And my experiences are not universal. I know that. But I'm also willing to bet that we've all had a moment in our lives that we disliked ourselves because we didn't fit into the mold of the gender we think or thought we were. This is why I look at trans and gender nonconforming folks as leaders in this exploration of what we used to know of gender, identity, and for me, sexuality. And while the science and history of it is just catching up, as science and history can do, gender-expansive folks have existed for a long time. To give you a couple of examples, we have the Hijra in India, the Mushe in Mexico, the Mahu in Hawaii, and of course the Two-Spirit folks in many indigenous tribes, to name a few. The first documentation of Hijras begins in 1226. Mujes in pre-Spanish colonization, circa 1519. The Mahu peoples were first documented in 1789 during the colonization of their land. And Two-Spirit folks, which is only a simplified English translation of many indigenous words for gender-varying people in the vastness of indigenous tongues, have been present for their whole history. Here, I present them in contrast of past and present, to at least let you know that trans and gender nonconforming folks have always been a part of our society across this planet. They've always just been actively erased from our history and continue to be scapegoats for the pursuit of control and power. And I say continue to be because many anti-drag bills in this country are still also anti-trans and anti-non-binary bills. And to tie it back to the art, because we are, after all, in the art sector, let me share the example of Shakespeare companies in Tennessee, Texas, Utah, worried about their productions and talking to lawyers for the first time because they didn't know. If you didn't know, there's a lot of plays in Shakespeare's that involve a character playing another gender, particularly worrisome to folks who say it's to the public. And William Shakespeare has a lot of connection with drag, most importantly, its origin. Everyone, look at my bestie. This earring, such hide energy. Love him. So in Shakespeare's time, women weren't allowed to be actors on stage because sexism and patriarchy, yes, correct. So men would often cross-dress to fulfill the part. And it's that then the drag originates from his productions because the gowns that we wear were just drag on stage. Another theory is that it was a stage direction for dress as a girl, an acronym. Here are just a couple of plays that involve a character playing another gender. We have Cymbeline, where Imogen plays as Fidel. The Merry Wives of Windsor, where Falstaff plays as the fat woman of Brentford. That is the title of a character, I'm so sorry. The Merchant of Venice, where Portia plays as Balthasar. We have Two Gentlemen of Verona, where Julia plays as Sebastian. We have As You Like It, where Rosalind plays as Ganymede. And Twelfth Night, where Viola plays as Cesario. You know, just a couple out of the many plays that he has. And speaking of 12th Night, Chicago Shakespeare Theater season opener. Thank you. Which, in my opinion, deals the most with gender variance. This production started yesterday in previews, and it's directed by Tyrone Phillips. It's set in the Caribbean, so if you ever happen to be in Chicago or want to see this show and feel like you're taking a vacation, visit chicagoshakes.com for more information. I couldn't go do this without a quick shameless plug about my company and our work. And I also couldn't do this presentation about gender without involving my favorite art form, drag. So drag is thought of as the performing of gender. And this is where you can have the proclaimed queen of drag, RuPaul, who's an absolutely phenomenal female impersonator. But we can also have drag kings, who perform a version of masculinity. Here is one of my favorite drag kings, Tenderoni from Chicago. Big fan, love her, give her all her dollars. We can also have bio kings and bio queens, who are people who still identify with the sex they're born with, even in drag. Here we have Memo Reyri, a bio king from Mexico and competitor of Mexico's drag competition, La Más Draga, performing as an exaggerated version of masculinity. This outfit, too, is giving me very much Walter Mercado vibes, who is also in many ways deconstructing gender and performing drag, if you know who that is. So if we're to consider drag as the performance of gender, I also have to introduce you other drag artists. You. You are performing gender every day. It may not be as big, as bold, as grandeur, or involve this much makeup as drag artists, but you are making choices that are attached to the gender you have given yourself. Since we're examining the choices we are making, let's talk about making inclusive choices. However, because inclusivity also involves more than just gender, let's today talk about making gender-aware choices. I know a lot of you are data nerds. I get it. I too use data to see what choices we have to make later in the day and how best to proceed. And I also know that sometimes we need data to prove that these are important things to talk about. And convincing folks in leadership and major donors, for me, because I am a fundraiser, about why we're making these changes. I'm calling that being objective to my subjective. In other words, having evidence about the thing that I am passionate about is not just important to me, and it's not just a personal project that I care about, that other folks are also affected by these changes that we're hoping to make. It's a bit sad that we need data for this, but alas, that is how I'm battling the systems in place. So why does this data matter to you? It helps our interactions with patrons, donors, who may exist outside of the binary, and also because data can be very gendered, because we have been very gendered, so finding ways to be respectful to people outside of it is very important. Here's an example of Tessitura. As you can see, this is our CRM for those of you who don't know. There's nothing in the top that has my pronouns. There's two places in SET currently where I can add gender. It's a prefix, where I can add MX for mix, the gender neutral honorific. I prefer to just say Carlos. Feel free to call me Carlos. And also the gender drop-down box, which can have added gender options and very customizable. And while you may not have Tessitura, you're welcome to add up any options within your CRM or even your Excel spreadsheet. That still works. And there's just a lot still to improve upon, but at least having a place to mark that data is a good start. Things we can do now in things of data, particularly when we're gaining new folks into our audience or in donors, only adding prefixes to names if stated by the constituency. First names are still just foundational, respectful ways to address someone. Adding options for gender marking whenever you are asking that question, not assuming that the man is the first constituent, particularly thinking if the spouse of that man may be the one who engages you the most. I've talked to a lot of major gift donors officers who choose to still do this way. I think it's wild to me. And aliases are a great way when someone changes a name, particularly thinking of our trans siblings who may not be out or have fully transitioned in their workplace or not their personal lives, but we still want to keep a tabs on them and the things that they're accomplishing. Me as a fundraiser, I just collect all that data. So if you don't have that data, how can you be the most respectful? And thinking about who in your non-binary circles is the most respectful, for me, is the way to go. Another way of making gender-aware choices is thinking about what is the language we are using. Here I think about introducing yourselves. And we've been really great at this conference, bravo to everyone, about stating your pronouns, because we're making it aware that gender is beyond binary. Just to go off of, this is the reason we use them to make inclusive spaces and trans-aware spaces. Examples of that has been seen as she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, but also they, she, a mixed pronoun, which I know can be a little complicated at times for someone who uses them. And so let me go a little bit more in depth about them. Pronoun pairs can be used to communicate a number of nuanced things. Some examples that we'll use the they, she pronoun pair that we just saw. It means that it could say, I identify as non-binary, but also as a woman, I do not feel that womanhood tells my full story, but I'm not fully divested from it either. It could mean she, her is fine, and not an offensive way to refer to me. However, I generally prefer to be they, them first, so I use they, them pronouns primarily. Or it could mean I use they, them pronouns, but I don't have the energy to correct people, very much been in that boat, and understand that I present femme. I don't present femme. I'm very butch today, just kidding. So the closest binary pronoun is fine. To give you guidance, it's pretty painless to ask. If that person is comfortable, they will share with you. But make sure that you're giving them time and space to do so, and not just like in the middle of a conversation with someone else. This conversation could be as easy as, hey, I use she or they pronouns. And you can say, cool, got it. Do you prefer one over the other? And whatever they say, that's the deal you got on for life until they decide to change it. Got it? Sweet, I see head shakes. I love the interaction. Order can matter in pronoun pairs too. He, theys, and they, he's, if you've ever met them, are not usually experienced the same. And while they communicate similar pronoun usage in grammar, they're just different folks. So a couple of examples given before. It can indicate preference, but also it can give a binary option for folks who tend to prefer to use the non-binary or neopronouns. And speaking of neopronouns, they're a category within the English language that are third-person personal pronouns, expanding beyond the ones we already know, like she, they, or he. Here's a couple of examples, and I know I saw a couple stickers earlier today in the entrance, which is excellent. This category of pronouns is ever expanding based on what we know and what makes people the most comfortable. And I also think it's phenomenal that we're acknowledging and seeing English language change to accommodate new information. Shakespeare himself created new words to fit in his place, so it just feels like we're continuing the spirit of Shakespeare in my mind. Some examples of what this could look like in your organization are putting them in your staff directory. And here we have one of my favorite organizations, the Woolly Mammoth, listing their staff pronouns. Shout out to the development team because woo. You can also have them in their programs for the staff and artists. Today, and this whole week actually, the public is collaborating with the Break the Binary Theater Festival. And in that program, also complimentary tickets if they haven't sold out yet. I didn't know about it until like 5 days ago. in their program, all of the artists, the creative team, the staff had their pronouns attached to the name, which is really cool. It doesn't take up a lot of space, and I think it's really wonderful that they're acknowledging, particularly for this festival, trans artists, non-binary artists, two-spirited folks for the whole week. You can also have them in events, and something that we've kind of acknowledged here today is having them in badges. Here you can see, here's Tessitura on my right. This is my right, yes. TLCC has them attached to the badge, just like here at Capacity Interactive. But if you can't have them on the badge itself, you can have them as stickers, which is also really great. The stickers at TLCC were brought in by the LGBTQ+ affinity group. I'm not entirely sure how much one's better than the other, but I think it's just really wonderful ways to find out flexibility depending on the budget. All great options. We can also think about being inclusive in our welcomings. I know sometimes we often hear, ladies and gentlemen, which is great, but we're all catching on that it's very binary, right? I prefer to say, ladies and gentlemen and all my gender rebels, because I think there's a revelry in it. It reminds me of a great quote by Ruth Messenger, I want to say, of like, rebels don't cause trouble, trouble make rebels. I absolutely adore that, and I do feel very much in line with that. However, if this is too rebellious for you, don't worry, I got you, girl. You can also say, welcome all. Really easy. I also enjoy y'all. Y'all is really cute. Me, particularly not being from the South, but being born in the South and in the South, I particularly enjoy reclaiming y'all as a like gender inclusive term, as opposed to like a Southern hospitality thing. I don't know, something about it feels rebellious. When addressing a patron, here I'm thinking of merges, letters, appeal solicitations, call center scripts, emails. I know oftentimes we have this question of, is dear sir, madam still okay? And you know, it could be, but oftentimes I think when we are addressing a patron, we know their first name already. So I very much prefer contacting someone by just their first name. I think it's easy. It leads into complications that take away from sexism, like Mrs. and Miss, removes gender neutrality, thinking of folks who have a gender neutral name, like Alex. It's just very fun. I think of it's wild that we go to the mental gymnastics of trying to address someone by an honorific when first name is literally right there. And for collecting data, because I know many of us like to send out surveys, they're great. But when asking about gender, determine why you're asking about gender in the first place. If you decide to ask about gender, be sure you don't conflate biological sex and gender and create questions that allows respondents to answer honestly and comfortably. Here's what not to do. And here's a couple of things could work better. I do want to reiterate, figuring out what to do with this data is a conversation worth having, because I hope no one out there is taking gender survey results to them and being like, oh, so our production of The Notebook, the musical, let's say, needs to be passed out to all the women in our database because women love rom-coms and they will come, you know? So this is how not to use that data, because as we all should know by now, all genders have different things that they like. Yes? Cool. Thinking of our front of house operations team. This is not my front of house team, just a picture. I couldn't get them together to take a picture, but I absolutely adore my front of house team, because whenever a patron comes to them asking for where the bathroom is, because we don't have gender neutral bathrooms, they're very adamant at teaching the front of house team, as well as the ushers, to communicate with the patron. Our men's restroom is this way, our women's restroom is this way, and our gender neutral is upstairs, regardless of the person asking, giving that person all the options that we have on the table. Yesterday, when I went to go see Break the Binary Theater, that public has the gender neutral bathrooms and clearly specify why they're choosing to do so. And it's divided between bathrooms that have just stalls and bathrooms that have urinals and stalls, and I thought that was absolutely adorable. I know that's also potentially a capital campaign for folks, so take that what you will. Press and media, because we often engage with them. Recently, I saw an example that really made sense for this presentation, so I'll share with you. This is NBC Het 5, Chicago actors triumph months after apartment destroyed in the fire. Really catchy. I'm so sorry for them. It is bad news. But I want you to first read the next line. You can't see it, so I'll read it for you. It says, a Chicago actor and his wife. And I'll stop there. A Chicago actor and his wife. And for those of you who don't know, this is Katie Sullivan. And thanks to my communication manager who taught me how to speak about her, Katie Sullivan is a Tony Award nominee, 4-time Paralympian, and will be our Richard III for our production of Richard III later this season. So for them to be completely erased from the sentence as an honorary person feels really weird, particularly when gender neutrality was literally right there. So not only is this kind of harder to do, and it involves back into the mental gymnastics of writing, but also a little bit sexist. So let's not do that. And also, just because you might be worried about them, they did lose their apartment and a lot of their possessions. However, after that, they decided to get married, and very small, very intimate, very sweet. And you can catch both of them in our production of Richard III this season. Again, I'm always plugging because that is how my communications team directed me. Thank you to them. So what can you do? As my former boss at Cincinnati Opera told me when I was doing events, go on the journey yourself. Whether you're planning events, an opening night, do communications, think of yourself as a trans or non-binary person and find out where those gender transactions are and see if there's a better way to do that without acknowledging the gender binary. It's always really been helpful for me. I'm no longer in events because that was a lot of hard work for me. I'd rather just do fundraising. But I think the lesson was really adamant and really helpful. So shout out to Joe Peacock at Cincinnati Opera. And also, because I'm me, I also have to acknowledge when culture acknowledges gender. And for this, I have to talk about Hispanic versus Latino versus Latine. How many of you know the difference? You can raise hands. Sweet, so not a lot. I'll be short and sweet, just like I am. I am 5'6". So Hispanic is the first term made by the US Census. Latino folks came up later to think about Latinidad, so not to be related to España, which is why we tend to use Latino more, to remove ourselves from the colonization history of Spain. But then gender-neutral folks from Latin America decided to make Latine. I decided not to involve Latinx in here, because while the term does originate for Puerto Rican higher academia, I just want to teach you all that Latine is not only made by gender-neutral folks from Latin America, but also very conducive to Spanish speaking. However, I also then have to present data, again, being objective to my subjective, that a lot of folks in the community have never heard of Latinx and much less Latine. And when we see this data, I think the first thing that you might be thinking is that, okay, so the majority of folks don't like Latinx, have never heard of it, let's just stick with Latino. And for this, I have to ask you questions because I'd rather much use Latine. Who is the most vulnerable in the community? And who gains the most by being seen? And for me, my answer is the Latino folks who are not even being acknowledged by the community they are a part of. So if you and your organizations can do that for them, I really imagine that community being attached to you stronger. And the education that is involved with it is also important, so always count me as a resource for more of that information. And because we're figuring out our values in this, I want to share with you a story. I wrote this in 2021 of January. It was my first article, I believe, with community-centric fundraising. They have a hub. And it's my story about how years ago, when I first started in fundraising, I was exploring my gender for the first time at work. I work nail polish, and I still occasionally do. My boss saw this and went so far as to buy me more nail polish. Yeah, really sweet. However, it was the same boss later on when we would go to a gala, a donor event, a donor meeting, where they would tell me, remove that, don't have that at those events. And it was a little confusing because I would go to these events and my artistic colleagues, very creative folks, would wear very colorful things, chunky jewelry, eccentric things. And here I was being told that I can't do any of that, even though I work in the arts. It led me to the conclusion that we're okay with risk and creative expression as folks until what's the word I'm looking for? Apologies, English is my second language and sometimes I struggle with finding the right word, until it conflicts with revenue. And that was really hard, thinking of my harm in fundraising, which is why I wanted to destroy fundraising from the inside out. But here's other places where I've seen it too. In dress codes, I experienced this a lot at clubs, and I don't mean like dancing clubs, I mean like donor clubs, where they still have dress codes. I think the most lenient I've seen is you can wear jeans now at a club, but apparently I can't wear chunky boots. I think of professionalism and decorum, particularly thinking of the many stories from Black folks saying they've been harassed from their natural hair from white clients and white audiences. and what that means and who gets to determine what professionalism is. And ultimately, it's all rooted in white supremacy, but then it's our job to combat those feelings and emotions from folks who feel that they have that kind of power over other audiences. And lastly, respect. I think sometimes as leaders or people who give money or people who've been seasoned subscribers for a long time feel that they have respect as an authority as opposed to respect as an individual. And when you disrespect them as an authority figure, they feel that they can disrespect you as an individual. And that's just not the case. So all I'd say is my journey of gender relevancy is my goal here. I mentioned here Patrick and David from Schitt's Creek. This is not a spoiler alert because this show has been on for years. This is a lovely couple. I absolutely adored their storyline in the show. But ultimately, for me, the take was that this relationship is boring. They play games, they cuddle in bed, they hang out. Nothing about that is extraordinary. It's just another relationship. And that's the same way I feel about gender. If we can make gender irrelevant, that's the way to go. And my presentation here, I hope, is not about making gender more relevant. It's about making gender irrelevant to the things we are doing in our workplace. Which leads me to, when you're loud and proud of your values, it's, I think, when you have the most people come to you. And I'll share my personal experiences that in my experience in sexuality and gender, the louder and prouder I've been about it, the more people I've lost in my life. Whether it's family, whether it's friends that I thought were close to me, they've decided not to engage with me anymore. But the people who were somewhat close decided to be closer. And the people who were in the margins and knew of me decided to interact for the first time. And I know I've seen this in organizations and professional life, because when many of us made our Black Lives Matter movements, I'm sure some of you had backlash from board members, major donors, subscribers who were like, we're not gonna engage with you until you decide to remove that. I know I've had that in my previous organizations. And I've seen that the louder we were about our values, the more people decided to come because we stood for something. So I hope you can take this to heart. So a couple of key takeaways as I near my end and get ready for Q&A. Gender is a 3D concept. Have fun in it. Find all the touch points. Go on that journey yourself and see where you can be gender neutral or gender irrelevant, really. Asking is always painless. Gather that data. Be loud about the values and the why. I think that's really important. And lastly, we are all learning about this all the time. So I'm only a point in your journey of this, and I'm always here as a resource if you need me. But I am not the expert. There's far better people out there, and hence why I'm so honored to be here, me sneaking in as a fundraiser to folks of many marketers and communication folks. This has really been an honor. Thank you so much. And with that,
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie O'Brien. I use she, her pronouns. I am a short, half white, half Asian person with dark brown, short hair. I'm wearing a floral blazer and squiggly brass earrings. And I have some questions for you.
Work.
The first question is from Emily. It's kind of elaborating on the question about gathering gender data in audience surveys. The question is, do you have any suggestions for how best to gather gender data in audience surveys? For instance, maybe is checkboxes not the best option? Is an open response better? What pairs of pronouns should be included? Anything else that you want to elaborate on?
Yeah, as you saw, I really enjoy when it's like, I enjoy it's a checkbox and then you can have an other where it's like a box that you can fill in. I think that's always great as we continue finding that there's many points in the gender cube to identify as folks. When thinking about pronouns, allowing for mixed pairs, I think it's easy to now do like he, they, she, they, then, them, and then also do like checkbox or radio button, is that what they're called? And then just put like whatever you'd like. Because I like to do he, they, sometimes I do like any. But I know that if we were to do all of the encompassing points as gender continues expanding, it would take the whole survey. So figuring out what works best is that. But I think the best method is something consistent and then open-ended.
Great.
Cute.
The next question is from Zach. It is a question about people, particularly young people, who may use different pronouns in public versus maybe what they use at home in front of parents or guardians. Do you have any advice on setting up or segmenting CRMs, communicating to honor and protect those young people?
Oh, let's have this conversation with the government. That's an excellent question. I don't engage with children because, not as a work person, because I have a nephew who is one in here. I work at a Shakespeare Theater, so like many of my folks, and then previously in an opera, so like children are not my experience. Personally, I would say it would just take so much communication to find a way for the children to have a resource to contact someone in the organization to let them know how they feel, and then for the staff to be the ones guarding them and that information. And I know that can feel like a lot, particularly when you're dealing with the dynamics, and also because we're dealing with the fact that the parents are usually the ones that are giving money, and because we live in a capitalist society, we like money. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer. I have access to the questions, so if anything comes to me, Zach, wherever you are, I will send you a message.
Great. The next question was submitted by a couple different people. It is a question about writing alt text for images. Yes. Do you have any advice on how to describe people's appearances in an inclusive or respectful way, especially when using stock imagery when we don't know the gender identity of the person?
Yeah, you can say a person. I introduce myself as an individual. Those are really easy. If you want it to be like fun, you could say like a person who is presenting butch, a femme-presenting person. Those terms exist. I mean, they have the caveat of being attached to the characteristics of what those terms mean. But I mean, if we're having fun, it's fun.
All right, and we have a question from Molly about in-person interactions. Do you have any suggestions for alternate greetings for in-person interactions when you don't want to say hi, sir, or thanks, ma'am, etc.?
Yeah, as I mentioned, for me, when I'm usually meeting someone, I tend to already have their names, and I've looked them up, how much money they make, how much capacity they have. So I've been really comfortable being like, hello, Adam and Joanne, or hello, Steve. However, if you don't have that information, which is why I say sometimes gather that data is really fun, I sometimes like to bring in one of my team members to be like, hi, this is my team member, Finley. And then Finley will say, hi, I'm Finley. And then that person will introduce themselves. So that way I can know how they identify before ever moving on. That's my trick of the trade. Feel free to take it home. Yes. However, if you are not comfortable with that, that's very okay. You could just say dear sir and dear madam, because I think ultimately gender non-conforming folks have an understanding that that is the way the world has been made, and while we're hopefully actively fighting against it, I don't think there's much offense. And also something I've learned from, I wrote an article about how fundraising and polyamory lessons in learning, and then I talk about the fact that fundraising is a polyamorous system, because I, as a donor, as a fundraiser, interact with multiple donors who love multiple people. Therefore, I'm a polyamorous fundraiser. So lessons from polyamory is that we have to sometimes cross a boundary and find out that was an offensive thing to do, and then understand that that's where the boundary was made. And then we'll never cross that boundary again. And so sometimes in this journey, thinking of gender, is that we have to acknowledge that sometimes we'll cross a boundary with someone, and the best we can do is say, I'm so glad you communicate with that. Thank you for letting me know. I won't repeat the offense, but now you have that information. You are therefore gathering that data. And that's also a really great way to do that. That was a long spin, yes.
Okay, great. Well, these questions are still coming in live, so we've got a few more. I'm just reloading, and more are coming in.
I'm glad. As those load in, I'm glad that this is. What's the word I'm looking for? I want to say relevant. I'm glad that this is touching so many of you. I know that I'm not necessarily providing things to always take home. It's rather conceptual. But that's because what gender relevancy looks like, doesn't have an end goal that is a one-size-fits-all model. It can look very different from your organization to the next one because of the communities we are in play. So feel free to continue asking those questions and make sense of what works best for your organization, where you as an individual are within that organization, and seeing what kind of data you can bring in later to back up your point.
Cool. We have a question from Cynthia about pushback from leadership.
Ooh, fun, I love these.
Yes. Do you have any advice for handling pushback from leadership on inclusion of pronouns for staff or guest artists at organizations?
So leadership is saying we can't have pronoun usage.
Yes, doing introductions, making sure everybody is including their pronouns when they're introducing themselves, and the guest artists.
If you have that knowledge prior to, I've told the artist to do it anyway, because it's really hard to push back against the artist, particularly someone who's coming in as a guest, and they can start that trend. Ultimately, however, you can also take the risk of doing it yourself and then just asking for forgiveness later, which is very fun for me because I have the bad mentality that, like, because I'm a fundraiser and there's a team of 4, we love low capacity at the moment, that they won't fire me because people need to raise money. But that's where I stand, and there's some privilege in that, of course. But it is about, I think of this also in like ethical fundraising, community-centric, anti-capitalist fundraising, where you have to find people who support you within your same organization. And there really is power in numbers. And whether that might not be your supervisor per se, it could be your colleague in a different department. And interspersing that information from bottom to top does work, particularly when there's growth in numbers. Yeah.
Kind of similar to pushback from leadership. Another question is from Shannon about specifically about neopronouns. In your experience, what is the most effective response to inevitable pushback from other patrons or leadership?
Yeah, I want to start by sharing a story from a recent colleague I just met who uses neopronouns and told me that they were offered a leadership position at an organization. But ultimately, when the search committee found out that they used neopronouns, they decided not to go for this candidate because they didn't want to do the effort of educating their staff or their patrons. So I want to share that because this is real and it's happening now, and the dangers are alive. So if someone's using neopronouns, can you repeat the question for me? At least the later half.
Yes. In your experience, what is the most effective response to inevitable pushback from other patrons about neopronouns?
Oh, fun. This is easy, actually. Language is fluid. It's ever-changing. And a real good example is that we're no longer talking in Shakespeare English. Like I think it's wild that we're not acknowledging that grammar has changed and that while there are rules to it, we're also so accustomed to breaking those rules. And I find it particularly weird in the arts and culture sector because a lot of our art is talking about societal problems of today's age. So to not be comfortable with acknowledging new ways of identifying feels rather odd to me. So combating with the fact that, again, gain support, find data if you can find it, and I know it exists out there, but also tell them, like, language is fluid and you might not like it now, but it's continuously growing. And that's just the fact.
Okay, we have a question from Kaylin. Do you have any suggestions on how to prioritize inclusivity on a large scale as a brand maybe continues to grow and adapt? So that's a broad question.
Yeah, what was the last part, love?
Thinking about a brand continuing to grow and adapt, how do you prioritize inclusivity when doing that?
Great question. I think about often, and I somewhat touched on it, I think about how do we touch the folks who are most vulnerable and state our values? And when thinking about brand and inclusivity, I also have to think about the fact that a lot of the work we're doing in inclusivity efforts are just removing the barriers that were in place to not have people. Like, I think about the fact that a lot of our efforts are just trying to get folks in the house because a lot of the work when our art form originated was excluding people. And I think of the fact that, like, my job as a fundraiser wouldn't be possible had people from the get-go been accepted into the organization. I wouldn't be convincing folks that arts matters if people were just told that art mattered from the get-go and everyone gave into it. Does that make sense? So when thinking of inclusivity, I first have to think about, like, what are the barriers that we ourselves placed in this organization, in this sector, in this culture, and how do I remove those? And I'm not even thinking of, like, gender. I'm thinking of, like, demographics, ethnicity, age, and how do we work best at removing those things? And the first thing to do, I think, is acknowledging that those things exist and knowing that we are continuing that, not purposely. It's just the way we've been trained. It's the way we've been taught, which is why I think oftentimes, all of us have our journey in finding how to be not transphobic and how to not be racist and how to not be sexist, because how can we not be when this world taught us to be? And after acknowledging that, then we have to be like, I am going to be an active fighter on it. And if you're not comfortable with active fighting like I am, you can just be a supporter, particularly if you have privileges. And you can do that in your organization by sharing resources, by sticking up for staff who is speaking about this information and this knowledge. There's so many ways to be a supporter. And I no longer call it allyship because it feels very not active. The social justice movement calls it accomplices. And I very much think of, like, Batman and Robin, how Batman's an active fighter. And no joke, we don't support Batman because he is pro-cop and he just could have fixed and, and Batman could have solved Gotham if he just paid his taxes. But like, Batman's an active fighter and Robin's an accomplice, like, actively doing things even when Batman's not there. So that's the way I think of, like, really being fighting for inclusivity.
Okay, we have one last question, but if anybody has any more, please feel free to submit. We have a few more minutes. But the last question right now is, what do you think is the best way to advocate for gender-inclusive programming specifically, so programming within arts organizations?
Tell them it's happening. Give them the example of Break the Binary Theater Festival. I didn't even know it was happening until a couple of days before I arrived, and getting to see the fact that that whole festival was made by and for trans, non-binary, two-spirit folks, and that it's being sold out. Here, and like, I was on the verge of tears seeing how phenomenal that was and the support it's gotten, and understanding that regardless of wherever you are in this country or sometimes outside of it, trans, non-binary, two-spirit folks exist, and they deserve to be seen and valued just like anyone else. And those stories deserve to be shared on stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much.